Good evening, and welcome to all of you. I'm UC Santa Cruz Chancellor George Blumenthal, and I want to really thank all of you for joining us tonight for the 16th Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. But before I delve into a little bit about the series and how it came to be, I'd like to recognize the wonderful musicians who entertained us before tonight's event. These are current UC Santa Cruz student Keshav Batish and his father, Ashwin Batish. And Keshwan himself is a third-year student at Porter College, so we're very grateful to both of you. It was so lovely. The Maitra Lecture is a much-anticipated event that really enriches the intellectual life of our campus and of the community at large. I see these lectures as a moment when we can all come together to mull over the issues of our time and to do so from a humanistic perspective. The humanities can be lost in our high-tech obsessed society, but really, they're more important now than ever. And I'm delighted to tell you that the humanities are very much alive and well at UC Santa Cruz. Over the years, the Maitra series has brought us speakers offering great insight into a wide range of topics. Writers, academics, artists, Nobel laureate economists. Last year, Bro Adams was wonderful as our last lecturer in 2016. And Martin Hellman, a Stanford professor emeritus of electrical engineering, our 2008 Maitra lecturer, is actually here with us tonight. All of these were intellectually enriching evenings, as I'm sure tonight will be as well. Because tonight I'm excited to hear from Nirupama Rao, a retired Indian diplomat, foreign secretary, and ambassador, as well as a scholar and a poet. And as a side note, I read today that Donald Trump Jr. is in India today, speaking today possibly on US and Indian relationships. And I have to be honest with you, I'm much more interested in hearing what Nirupama has to say tonight. For this series, we owe thanks to one woman, Anu Luther. She has been a great friend to UC Santa Cruz. She is currently a UC Santa Cruz Foundation trustee. She is the former foundation president. She was a professor at one time of economics right here at UCSC. She was also formerly a special advisor to the chancellor, actually to me, on international initiatives. And she is herself an entrepreneur and a businesswoman. She launched this series in honor of her late husband, Sid Maitra. Sid was a scientist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist of great vision, and with a deep appreciation of the humanities. And so this lecture series is a wonderful legacy in that it preserves Sid's memory while expanding our horizons. Please join me in welcoming Anu Luther, who will tell you more about the Maitra lecture series and about our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Mic okay? I should leave it this way? Better? Okay. Good evening. The lecture series, as Chancellor just mentioned, was born of a shattering grief after the death of my husband of 25 years. But now it is gathered in community. Endowed by my friends, Kiran and Arjun Malhotra, who joined me, delivered mostly by friends, supported always by the leadership and staff of our campus, and attended by you, members of the larger community, my community. I'm deeply moved and honored Thank you all. Thank you, Chancellor Blumenthal, Provost Trump, Deans Mitchell and Solt. Thank you, Kristen Palmer and Suze Howells, for your generous and efficient help with the planning, logistics, even the crisis management. Thank you, Tom, for my now husband, that's a private joke, for your steady and fierce support. Thank you, Sonali and Julio, Aditya and Patrick, my kids forever. Thank you, Sonia and Shobna, for your representation of friends and friendship. This is the 16th in a series with a uniformly stellar array of speakers and topics, but they may seem bewilderingly disconnected from one another. What is the theme? Where is the mission statement, I'm often asked. Sidhartha, Sid, initiated and provided the founding endowment for the university's now thriving Indian classical music programs, so forgive me if I use an unfamiliar metaphor of the raga, a unique central feature of the genre. There are many, many ragas. Each one has its own complex grammar within which individual notes are intoned, expressed, and ornamented. Every raga creates its own distinct mood. It takes years of what is called full ear listening to recognize and identify a rag. We have been playing the same raga all these years, but 16 performances later, it is time to christen the series. I can hear Sid say, Anu, ornamentation is important. The improvisation gives each performance its unique charm, but the underlying melodic structure is essential. That's what defines the raga. Don't let difference distract you from sameness. That then is our mission statement. The rag Manava. Manav meaning human. Manava, of the human condition, thus the raga of humanism. Not sure if a rag with that name exists, but perhaps Dard, I'm not sure he's here, or Inderjeet can tell us later. Now, this year, we quickly settled on Ambassador Rao. What better time than now for the topic, diplomacy and the feminist voice? We are coming off a year in which we heard an escalating and dangerous war of words between two men, the most intemperate presidents of the United States of America and North Korea. And that was not the only crisis of macho diplomacy last year. We saw our first glorious, empowering women's march to protest the election of Donald Trump. We hashtagged Me Too en masse and in unison to protest sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. We have a record number of women who have announced their intention to run for public office. For a speaker, we could not have chosen better. Nirupama Menon Rao has been a career diplomat among India's most distinguished, entrusted with the most prestigious but also challenging assignments. And what a glorious finish she had. Foreign Secretary, equivalent of Secretary of State, and ambassador to the US. She was also India's first woman ambassador to the People's Republic of China, first woman spokesperson in Delhi's Ministry of External Affairs, first woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. A lot of first womans, but she also beat the boys. In the competitive exam that is used to select India's brightest to serve in the elite Indian Foreign Service, she ranked number 1. So much for that woman question. After 4 decades of service, she retired, but not really. Nirupama writes regularly on foreign policy matters and is working on a book on Indo-China relations. She's currently a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Nirupama is a poet. Her book of poems, Rain Rising, combines breadth of vision with modulation of tone, a combination that I think almost defines her. She is the poet Aurora Leigh and Romney Leigh fighting against injustice, the combination. She's not just a lover of Western music, opera, classical, folk, pop. She's also a singer and songwriter. She combines her talents and passions. She worked backwards from an operatic version of Thomas More's epic 1817 poem, Lala Rookh, about a Mughal princess, to write a scholarly piece on how the poem represented, even shaped, Western imaginings about Kashmir and India. Now, there's a lesson in developing brain plasticity for seniors in retirement. For the series, we knew that whichever song she sang, it would be in the Rag Manava. And through it, she would hold her female, feminine, feminist voice. Biology, culture, and politics all intersect in her. Nirupama is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a first-wave feminist pressing for suffrage in the UN Security Council for India, a country significant in numbers yet excluded. As she renegotiated unfair trade treaties for her country, she was, as it were, reciting a second-wave mantra, appropriately everted for international diplomacy. The political is personal. Poor third world women are the worst victims of capitalism, colonialism, and paternalism. When their intersectional lives matter, all lives will matter. She is Angela Davis. She is also a riot girl who stood strong and empowered on the world stage wearing a sari. As herself, for herself, not as an object of colonial expansion and capitalist exploitation. She has just released an album of songs, Peace is My Dream, somewhat different from the manifesto, Revolution, Girl Style Now, but I'm sure that the Bikini Kill would honor contradictory experience as genuinely third wave. Today, Nirupama is a hashtag fourth wave feminist with her own e-zine, a Facebook account, and a Twitter account with, I just checked, with 1.4 million followers. In many of her recent public addresses, there's an exhortation to young women to enter public service. Her international drive towards parité. Thus, Nirupama is not only a diplomat whose job it is to defend borders, but she speaks the universal language of music and poetry, which transcends borders. In her seriousness of purpose nestles comfortably alongside softness and charm. You can sense her unflinching resolve about the goal, but she also communicates flexibility on how to get there. She's pragmatic about the real meaning of her job. The business of diplomacy is business, I heard her say, but at the same time, she insists that growth must be inclusive and sustainable. She's not afraid to say, war is never the answer. Let's sit down and resolve our problems. The choice of Nirupama was a political statement, no doubt, but it was also ultimately a personal choice. The two are always linked for me. But Tom and I have 6 grandchildren, and the baby among them is here. Mari. Oh, she's up. Hello, Mari. Okay. Mari, she's a true fourth wave product. She has 2 fathers, married to each other. She's part Chinese, part white, some Native American, and a lot the other kind of Indian. Not sure how they left out African. But my hope is that years from now, when Dea and Amaya, Ryan, Rafa, Taj, and Mari recall the excitement of seeing Black Panther, they will remember the message of Wakanda, not just the hair. That would be a true legacy of a grandfather expressed in this series. So, briefly, back to Sid and his raga. He would have said to me, Anu, don't spend so much time parsing the F word, female, feminine, feminist. Don't overthink this first wave, second wave, nth wave progression. It's really simple. They all have the same letters, F-E-M, for fairness, equity, meaning. And your performer today comes from the Rao Gharana, R-A-O, RAO for reason, accommodation, and open-mindedness. Just listen to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Anu, for those wonderful words of introduction. I'm not sure if I deserve all those accolades, but you spoke from the heart and I'm really touched. It's a wonderful privilege to be here to deliver the Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. I never knew Sid personally, but listening to you speak about him, meeting your children, I understand what a special and unique person he was. And I'm honored to be delivering this lecture today. To President Blumenthal, to the Provost, to the Dean, Professor Tom Kylett, thank you for being here. It's great to be back in California. I've somehow made this pilgrimage to California almost every year over the last 6 years, I think. So it's always wonderful to be back here. When Anu and I discussed the theme of my speech today, we went back and forth, but we were quite fixated, quite decided that it should have something to do with the feminine contribution, with the feminine identity, with the feminine voice. And we decided that we would apply the concept to diplomacy, the profession in which I've spent much of my life, and where I've seen what the role of women can be, and also the absence of the feminine voice. So my lecture is therefore called Diplomacy and the Feminist Voice. And I will speak more about the feminist in that voice as we go along. I will start with the concept of gender. Gender as we use it in daily speech, in the grammar of daily life, men, women, each holding up their section of the sky. In India, we have less women than men, which could get one started on a wholly different story. But we refer to the country as Mother India, in the feminine. As our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, said long ago, he saw India's soul as feminine. We have had a powerful Prime Minister, a woman Prime Minister, at one stage of our current history. She was Indira Gandhi, referred to at the height of her fame as the woman goddess who was a slayer of demons, the image being current during the birth of Bangladesh and the defeat of the Pakistani general known as the Butcher of Dhaka, Yahya Khan. We are here to talk of diplomacy and the feminist voice. I notice that feminism was the most looked up word in the Merriam-Webster dictionary last year. Feminism as defined thus, and I'll quote, the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes and organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. In real life, we are a little reluctant to use the word feminist as it implies, I don't know why, being against men. Some suggest we use the word gender equality instead. In any case, equality is what we aspire to and what we want. We need not be encased by definitions. Now, you may say diplomacy is basically gender neutral. It does not occupy itself with she's and he's. It is the art of getting peace to triumph over war and conflict, the skillful and quiet negotiation, the mastery of facts and consolidation of knowledge, the alert and the observant mind, and adeptness of communication. Where does the feminist voice fit in all this? This is what we are set to explore in modest measure this evening. A little more than a year ago, I wrote a piece for a major Indian newspaper called "Have the Women Spoken?" And speaking as a South Asian, I said the following: I often wonder what a feminist foreign policy for South Asia would look like. In Europe, the Swedes have it, we do not. Can we not consider a discourse that speaks of matters beyond war and peace? Peace in the South Asian subcontinent seems to be associated with white flags, surrender, submission, weakness. Do we not think of a South Asian commons? Not an arena of mutual jousting, where we bait each other for blood sport, but a space for maturity of peaceful purpose, robust civility, and mutual accommodation? We have built towering Babels around ourselves, but we have not cleared the way for the commons. I took the view that not much distinguishes, for instance, Indian and Pakistani women from each other. We share similar genealogies and labor under the same masculine patriarchies. We care similarly about our children, our homes, our environments. We are programmed to be peacemakers, each in our own small way, and we weep similarly for lives lost. We want literacy, we want empowerment, liberation from hierarchies that keep us confined in spaces and prevent the full flowering of our talents as capable, gifted human beings. So why, then, do we women subscribe to the popularly expressed shibboleths about India and Pakistan, the endless litany of retributive give and take? This cannot be just a relationship that has nuclear weapons at its core. Neither can it just be about victimhood, Indians as victims of cross-border terror, or Pakistanis as victims of perceived Indian arrogance or inflexibility. It is about our future and whether we wish to sentence ourselves to the nightmare we have made our own, because win-win is not a concept we understand. And through it all, there is the festering problem of Kashmir. Kashmir, the incomparable, the valley that embodies the crucible of our opacity and rigidity in both India and Pakistan, of sorrow, of alienation. I said that a feminist foreign policy would embrace the idea of a South Asian commons. It would speak and act in favor not of ravishing disunities, but of rationalizing unities, of merging capacities to build, to develop, to link. It would urge, I'm sorry, this mic is a little. It would exercise vetoes to block war, not peace. It would emphasize the right to food, the right to health, the right to knowledge and learning, the right to reject the disconnects, the worn cliches, and the mental barriers that divide us. I should probably come and stand there, I think, and speak, because this mic is falling off. So to continue, it would weigh the interests of humanitarianism. Anu just spoke about the Manava Raga. So here we are with humanitarianism, and against the interests of power with far greater precision and wisdom. It would say no to violence against all, but particularly crimes against women and children. It would reject the voices of the far right and the far left. It would feel the true pulse of the unknown, the marginalized, and the excluded. It would have a people-centered approach on both sides of the divide across the line of control to healing the wounds in Kashmir. It would promote business-to-business engagement, building the infrastructure for trade, removing non-tariff barriers, facilitating commerce, understanding the economics of proximity, rather than promoting proximity as a peril. Why sacrifice these benefits at the altar of history? Rather, promote these possibilities as assets that can alter the narrative of the past and realize the prospects of peace that have hitherto been so elusive. Is this an idea for our time? Cynical public trials conducted in the Indian or Pakistani media do not provide the answer. We need sense and sensibility, not pride and prejudice in relations between India and Pakistan. Yet another feminine voice of our region, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, once said to a global audience, "Let us sweat in peace, not bleed in war." I asked, could we as South Asians, particularly as Indians and Pakistanis, have the courage, the boldness, the foresight to think differently? Learning the art of mutual accommodation in solving the problems that have kept us in this state of hostility and mutual enmity is not a loss of manhood. It may, I concluded, just signal the dawn of a truly feminist region. Typically, as it often happens in our times today, I was greeted with a tsunami of mansplaining machismo comment. One of the more civilized comments, I won't speak of the others, trying to strike a note of patriarchal condescension, said, "The author's pipe dream of feminist foreign policy will die before it is even conceived. Very disappointing and a waste of time," unquote. Clearly, given the politics of the subcontinent, very few vest their hopes in crafting a future where the women of the region lead with their voices and actions to build a peace that overrides conflict. Peace is clearly only a dream. Years after the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 regarding women in peace and security, many countries have yet to come up with national action plans that spell out their strategy. I know that India does not have one, taking the line that the Security Council cannot be the source of international law of a general nature. All the same, I ask, what prevents the enactment of an ab initio national strategy that is inclusive on the participation of women in peace negotiations and conflict prevention? One answer I was given was that the gender, male I'm referring to, that cannot work out issues for itself is not going to deliver on others. I said at the outset that diplomacy as we see it today is gender neutral, but that does not imply that diplomacy cannot be populated more than it is with issues that concern the well-being of humankind as a whole, of whom women are an indivisible component. Women have been present at those moments of history that have crafted the shape of the world today, beginning with the San Francisco Conference and the setting up of the United Nations, the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, replacing the rights of man with human rights, encompassing men and women, and have lent powerful voices to the finalization of international statutes that govern the welfare of women and children in conflict. When women are victims of war and social, political, and economic upheaval, when they are anchorless migrants cast upon a river of no return, left to fend for their hapless children, when they are exploited in conflict and agency-less, when enslavement is alive and well in the 21st century, where then are the women's voices to shape agendas and outcomes so that more sense and sensibility prevails? Countries are not summarily wiped off the map in acts of masculine hubris and the whirlwind reaped under the perceived responsibility to protect. The question I ask, drawing reference to the definition of feminism, is, can diplomacy organize itself more effectively so that outcomes take into account the interests of these largely silent multitudes that comprise women? Can women make themselves more effectively heard? Very often, those women who make it to the top echelons of diplomatic life seem to have no option but to adopt approaches that differ little from their male colleagues. Is diplomacy then a straitjacket, restrictive, offering little scope for the articulation of the female voice? Yes, the female voice. How often is it heard across the climate-controlled portals of international affairs? It seems to me that too few women are seen in that world, and even those that are there are an exotic species, hothouse flowers, as it were, to be celebrated, no doubt, but not wrestlers in the amphitheater. They say the strongest indicator of a state's progressiveness is not its democracy or wealth, but the way it treats its women and how much the latter issue impinges on the national consciousness. Obviously, strength lies in numbers. Where I come from in India, the numbers of women in international studies or relations are to be counted. They are mostly conspicuous by their absence in panel, or I just learned a new word, manel, discussions, and often overlooked when it comes to such participation, since the male experts are the default choice. The contributions of women are mostly forgotten. I have myself been a victim. But there is all this talk of feminist foreign policy these days. The Swedes, the Canadians have all climbed the bandwagon. These countries have a well-established profile of being identified as flag bearers for peace building, peacemaking, upholders of human rights, working against sexual violence and discrimination, anti-proliferation, etc. These are issues that in the general sense have been very much a part of their foreign policy playbooks for some time. Did they really need a definition in terms of gender as tools to be deployed by feminist foreign ministers? Do they place the world on a new trajectory? I think the jury is out. In the real locus of power, the UN Security Council, the responsibility to protect becomes a tool driven more by the raw calculus of strategic interest, the commandeering of resources, and even beyond the Security Council, the cases of Libya and Syria and Iraq show the complete insensitivity to the facet of human dislocation, the destruction of societies and human heritage, the erasing of history, and the effects on the welfare of women and children. The arbiters of destiny are the men politicians and statesmen playing God and seemingly guiltless about induced suffering. And very often, I must say, women foreign ministers go along. We are yet to find a way in which we combine feminine soft power with masculine hard power to create that ideal yin and yang in diplomacy. There is also the problem of stereotyping. The fact is that in the exceptional cases where women have risen to top diplomatic positions, the stereotyping is difficult to throw off, especially by a world media, mostly dominated by the men. When Vijayalakshmi Pandit became the first woman president of the UN General Assembly in September 1953, this was how the event was reported by The Hindu, a newspaper from Chennai in southern India. I quote, "The president's job is neither a sinecure nor that of a figurehead. It carries no financial remuneration, only an overload of responsibility out of all proportion to the frail feminine shoulders which are going to bear it during the year ahead. Mrs. Pandit's will be the sole task of interpreting complex, ambiguous rules of procedure of the Assembly, on the able performance of which depends not merely the expedition of business, but amicable handling of all the many problems before the House." Unquote. Please note the reference to the overload of responsibility out of all proportion to the frail feminine shoulders which are going to bear it during the year ahead. Frailty, thy name is woman, is the subtext. 60 years down the line, the problem has not gone away. Leadership positions held by women are few and far between. Seen and not heard, the old dictum applies. And the field of diplomacy is no exception. An American friend of mine who traveled to India for a policy dialogue was greeted by one of the male organizers of the conference with the words that he was so glad that she had, as a woman, been able to make the long journey across 7 seas, as it were, to the conference. Talk of caring condescension. The Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, is absolutely justified when she says that striving towards gender equality is not only a goal in itself, but also a precondition for achieving our wider foreign development and security policy objectives. Her strategy focuses on the 3 R's: promoting the rights of women and girls, supporting women's representation in decision-making, and ensuring financial resources for promoting gender equality. Rights, representation, and resources. I do not believe any government worth its name should have any quarrel with any of these concepts when they apply to women. They are so politically correct, so why dispute them? But the devil is in the implementation, the sincerity with which these goals are pursued, the zeal with which they are applied to society at large, because therein lies the hope and the prospect for more mainstreaming of women and gender-related issues into the societal commons. And each country has to develop its own dynamic in this regard. There is no one playbook that we can automatically relate to or apply. Allow me to digress a little. I'd like to speak a little about women in the Foreign Service. A few years ago, the British author Helen McCarthy authored an interesting study called Women of the World, which was essentially about women diplomats and their struggle to be accepted in a male-ordered diplomatic universe. Reading through her study, I drew some conclusions. Firstly, for those who assume the female diplomat has been around for a long time, a study of history will reveal otherwise. The only women in the world of diplomacy until the early 20th century were the ambassadresses or wives of ambassadors. A New York Times report in 1902 spoke of how in drawing rooms, courts, or at any royal function which ladies attend, it is the ambassadress, not the ambassador, who has to be considered. Sometimes she is a touchy personage indeed. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography said of Lady Harriet Dufferin, whose husband went on to become the Viceroy of India, that she was regarded as the most effective diplomatic wife of her generation. These were not career diplomats, but wives of powerful men who left a mark on history with their charm, wit, charisma, and ambition. In 1933, it was stated in a debate in the British House of Commons, the special virtues of women are singularly ill-adapted to diplomatic life. Counted among womanly virtues were intuition and sympathy, regarded as absolutely fatal to diplomacy, tempting people to jump to conclusions, and the latter equally fatal since it caused people to identify with causes or personalities with which or whom they feel sympathy. Together, it was concluded these virtues, again, would be fatal to that very balanced attitude which it is the business of the diplomatic service to preserve. In Britain, one reason advanced to establish that a career in embassies and consulates abroad was not for a woman was that they would be at an automatic disadvantage dealing with such categories as drunken sailors. Now, this is reminiscent of an argument often heard in similar contexts, I've heard it in India, that women in embassies would be misfits since they could not go to the airport to receive dignitaries at night. A 1934 press report spoke of a main objection to women in the diplomatic service being that a large proportion of the 400-odd posts are in unhealthy parts of the world. So McCarthy's account again speaks of the first women entrance to the British Foreign Office post-World War II. India, in fact, seems to have led rather than followed in this regard, since our first women diplomats entered the scene in 1948, whereas Mary Galbraith, the first woman Foreign Service appointee for Britain, began her Foreign Office career in October 1951. Our first career diplomat, woman ambassador, was C.B. Muthamma, who became ambassador to Hungary in 1970. The first British woman career ambassador was Dame Anne Warburton, who became ambassador to Denmark in 1976. So it's very recent. World War II had opened the space for women to prove their worth in many quasi-diplomatic areas of functioning, as also in intelligence work and communications. In the early 20th century, pioneers like explorer and archaeologist Gertrude Bell, an Arabist, left a huge imprint with their stellar work in the Middle East, despite the fact that there were men, like the British Member of Parliament, Mark Sykes, who described Bell as, I quote, a flat-chested, man-woman, globe-trotting, rump-wagging, blathering ass. Such diatribes apart, Bell was widely regarded as a combination of masculine vigor, hard common sense, and practical efficiency, all tempered by feminine charm and a most romantic spirit. You see the contrast in the descriptions. The Soviet Union had during this period led the way with the appointment of Alexandra Kollontai as ambassador to Norway in 1922. Kollontai's egalitarian instincts and sympathetic manner endeared her to many. And further, outnumbered by their male colleagues, a tiny minority of 4 women also affixed their signatures to the Charter of the United Nations in 1945. Now, I'd like to talk a little about, the professional conditions that restricted the entry of women into diplomacy traditionally. The marriage bar restricted the rise of women in the foreign service of countries like Britain and India for many years. It bore the stain of sex discrimination. India's diplomatic service lost many women stalwarts who quit their careers post-marriage. It was only in the early 70s that this iniquitous requirement, which prevented married women from applying for the foreign service, was dropped in Britain and in India. The advance of women to posts of a sensitive nature and responsibility in diplomacy has also been slow the world over. It is only in the last 2 decades that women secretaries of state in the United States were seen. In India, we now have a woman external affairs minister, Sushma Swaraj, who is our leading diplomat today. It was only in 2001, 54 years after our independence, that our first woman foreign secretary, Chokila Iyer, was appointed. McCarthy observes that the presence of women at leadership level in global summits is limited and exceptional, and there is a tendency to hold women to a higher standard. She notes, even in the 21st century, a woman wielding serious power in the global political arena is an oddity, a phenomenon to be explained rather than taken for granted. Not only is her performance subject to closer scrutiny than her male peers, but it often comes to stand as a test of the ability of all women and to reflect for good or ill the wisdom of allowing a woman to do a man's job. And these are truths that must be acknowledged. So what do women need most regardless of what their field of professional choice is? I believe it is voice, that which enables them to articulate their cause, their interests, and their aspirations. And voice needs amplification, the amplification that comes from numbers, from adequate representation. If women constitute 50% of the population, it is obvious that their representation in professions and in leadership positions should be equal to, or at least close to equal, that of men who are similarly placed. And how is it that this aspect is never in serious focus? In the Indian Foreign Service, for instance, the numbers of women are going up steadily, but nowhere even near half of the numbers of male diplomatic officers. The third aspect after voice and amplification relates to service conditions. In my own lifetime, I was witness to the long march we women had to undertake from what one legal luminary called, as I mentioned earlier, the stain of sex discrimination, where married women, diplomats, could not continue to work, where you could not apply to join the Foreign Service if you were married, and where you could scarcely aspire to the top positions of responsibility in the service. These were all egregious, grossly discriminatory requirements, an apartheid policy practiced against a particular gender. The third barrier was the last to fall, and it took a famous case launched again by Ambassador Muthama, one of our pioneer women diplomats, where she took the senior leadership of the Ministry of External Affairs to the Supreme Court of India to protest against their unwillingness to appoint her to the post of Vice Minister or Deputy Secretary of State, a post that was unquestioningly offered to male officers, despite the fact that she was equally qualified in terms of meritorious service and experience. It was another matter that the Ministry of External Affairs blinked first. They promoted her to the post of Vice Minister before the case came up for judgment, although while closing the case, the concerned judge said he was dismissing the petition, but not the problem being that relating to sex discrimination in service conditions. But let us return to Vijayalakshmi Pandit and to 1949, when she was appointed the first woman ambassador worldwide to the United States. If this was breaking news, it was truly deserving of being labeled thus. When asked by a woman journalist on arrival, I quote, "Tell me, Mrs. Pandit, how does it feel to be world feminist #1? She said, "I am not a feminist. As far as I can see, the question of being male or female has nothing to do with the duty of both sexes to take their part in world affairs," unquote. Then, as it happens often now too, much to her concern, the media took an inordinate interest in her coiffure, a type most women dream of but seldom achieve, her pastel saris, her great lady elegance, as she said, "I were a visitor from Hollywood." Now, Mrs. Pandit's reference to the duty of both sexes to take their part in world affairs was particularly telling. It symbolized a natural grasp of a universal truth that women have as much the right and responsibility to influence the course of human destiny and the flow of global events as their male counterparts do. And women like Mrs. Pandit brought a sense of proportion and determination to their job, qualities that embellished their natural gifts of resilience and intelligence. Life had taught her to understand the politics of revolution, the responsibilities of administration, and the possibilities and impossibilities of modern diplomacy, as one observer put it. There could not have been higher praise for her faculties and better proof of her qualification for the job. In fact, it is little wonder that the inspiration for women in post-independent India to enter public service was provided by women like Mrs. Pandit and another equally distinguished Indian woman, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. Here was another rooted cosmopolitan spirit shaking the world gently. She had a clear point of view about the contribution of women to the labor market, including the need to valorize the work that women performed in the household and for which they did not receive recognition or remuneration for their contributions, on racial discrimination, and also the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Her definition of human rights incorporated autonomy, dignity, and creativity. Here she is speaking of an Indian worldview in the years prior to independence, in a voice far ahead of her times, and in a tone even more progressive than the male stalwarts leading the freedom struggle. She points to India's peninsular outline as having widened into the global with an increasing awareness that we and the rest of the world are but part of a single sphere, that our destinies are inevitably linked, our paths interlocked. It is not idle curiosity or cheap sentiment which shapes the question that haunts and harasses every diplomat like a family ghost. What about India? We may well say everything. India is more than a test, it is a symbol. It is the mirror in which the world sees the shape of things to be. It is towards a world which recognizes the right of every nation to determine and rule its own destiny, but in a cooperative world order that the women of India and of the world have to strive for if humanity is ever to enjoy decency, peace, and happiness, unquote. Any consideration of the feminist voice in foreign policy cannot ignore the life and times of Indira Gandhi, India's first woman prime minister. Her example is particularly interesting because she led the country, at a time of momentous developments concerning not only domestic politics, but also India's external interface, both regionally and internationally. While she was not a hard realist or a consistent practitioner of realpolitik, Mrs. Gandhi led the country through a war with Pakistan, the creation of Bangladesh, the deterioration of relations with the United States under the Nixon administration, the recommencement of normalized ties with China, the first peaceful nuclear explosion of 1974, which effectively demonstrated the capability of Indian nuclear scientists to develop nuclear weapons, and also, finally, the passage from food shortages to agricultural self-sufficiency through the Green Revolution secured with American assistance. If her foreign policy reflected feminist qualities, these were difficult to discern, although it is difficult to deny its feminist core. She had little choice but to demonstrate that she could lead like a man in a man's world, intent of establishing that her pragmatism in politics set her apart from the romantic idealism of her father, Jawaharlal Nehru. She was memorialized as Durga, the goddess slaying demons, as I said earlier, after the birth of Bangladesh, but also as coming up short on ruthless determination in failing to ensure a settlement of the Kashmir issue in exchange for the return of 90,000 Pakistani prisoners of war during the Simla Conference of 1972. One can argue that leading a democracy as complex as India's is a daunting task in the best of times, and that Mrs. Gandhi, through the power of her example, did prove that women were as capable as their male counterparts in demonstrating charismatic leadership at critical times in a nation's history and making largely the right choices in exceptionally difficult circumstances. She had proven herself in such domain areas traditionally seen as male preserves as foreign policy, defense, security, and diplomacy. She had established herself as a globally recognized political leader as her successful international outreach campaign to highlight the national crisis caused by the refugee influx into India from the erstwhile East Pakistan in 1971 showed. Combining here feminine soft power with the steel of hard power to come, as subsequent events showed. She was, through her actions, creating a pathway for women of succeeding generations to follow, despite the fact that she had come to the Prime Ministership of India through being her father's daughter, rather than through a self-made trajectory of rising through merit and diligence from obscurity. In many ways, her success made it possible for middle-class India to suspend disbelief about women entering the arena of politics, national security, and diplomacy, and pursuing full-fledged careers in public service. In my own life, it encouraged our parents to actively encourage my sisters and myself to become professional women, without a shadow of doubt being raised about our capacity to out-achieve, if necessary, the sons of their friends and peers. The question, however, still remains whether women bring a purely feminine-oriented perspective to the conduct of public policy. While their contributions on the consolidation of the statutes on universal human rights or highlighting issues of racial discrimination and poverty may point to perspectives of gender justice, equality, conciliation, conflict prevention, there is little to suggest that women in foreign policy leadership have differed from men in handling situations of conflict, threats to national security, and foreign aggression. These women are placed in situations where they are often the sole woman among a cabinet of males, and the question of being solely guided by a womanly perspective does not simply arise. They exercise their judgment as the need of the hour dictates, and perhaps they are at pains to demonstrate that they are no less equal to men in taking muscular decisions. The issue would be different if the numbers of women in public policy decision-making were to substantially increase and if women are no longer in a minority. That becomes the inflection point for greater confidence and assertiveness in speaking out or leaning in a manner that is incorporative of concerns about the impact of decisions taken on gender equity, post-conflict scenarios, violence against women and children, sexual trafficking, conflict, migration, and human displacement. But until the numbers of women increase, the preponderant behavior will be to conform to prescribed codes and methods that are seen as best practices in decision-making paradigms long established in a world led by men. A decade after the UN adopted Security Council Resolution 1325, which speaks to the necessity of including women in peace agreements, 97% of military peacekeepers are still men, and less than 1 in 10 participants in peace negotiations are women. That India today has women holding the portfolios of defense and foreign affairs, in my view, has not signaled any path-breaking initiatives in independent, inspirational, feminist thinking in either of these sectors. The incumbents are seen as dutiful team players, steering clear of sensitive or big policy issues in their ministerial domain, or in trying to signal a more inclusive approach to issues involving women in peace and security. Nowhere is male patriarchy more in play than in the universe of social media. The trend is to overwhelm any point of view that does not conform to the stipulated common denominator of what constitutes the truth. Female opinions are subject to constant mansplaining by Twitter handles that are anonymous and ignorant. But social media, I must say, by way of its expansiveness and universal outreach, requires to be the arena where female views and feminist opinions must be freely propagated so that they take root and refuse to be dismissed by trolls or alt-news makers. It offers the scope of advocacy and the creation of agency. Advocacy because it promotes the accumulation of viewpoints and awareness about women's issues and female participation in policy making and legislative matters and enriches the debate. Agency because it promotes women's ownership of issues concerning their welfare and progress, their safety and well-being, their health and empowerment, and their rights to be agents of peace and security. We the people must include she the people. Social media provides that sounding board, that listening platform that increases engagement between civil society activists who want the empowerment of women. It enables their voices to be heard and to be introduced into the policy debate. I was struck recently by what an Afghan woman had to say about the future of her country. "We are not responsible for the destruction," she said, "but we should be responsible for the reconstruction. Women must play their leading role in in stopping corruption, political cronyism, the promotion of an identity that goes beyond ethnic, communal, or political interests. They must be the voice that secures fundamental rights and respect for a country's constitution, in building dialogue, promoting inclusive development, especially in responsible infrastructure, digital communication and energy, and fostering meaningful reform of national institutions. They must be heard in national politics, and their representation has to increase in consonance with their proportion of the population. They have to be partners, not victims. As a former British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, said in 2016, and I quote, "The full social, economic, and political empowerment of women is the greatest strategic prize of the 21st century," unquote. The greatest threats to peoplekind, as the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau says, should replace mankind, are threats of human peace and security. The role of women in peace negotiations and conflict prevention is inadequately recognized. Each country deserves a national action plan developed in its own sovereign capacity and recognizing its own unique requirements in this field. In countries like the Philippines, women negotiators have finalized peace agreements ending internal conflict. Nepal and Colombia are also countries where the sensitivity index to such issues is positive. The United States Congress just enacted the Women, Peace and Security Act, requiring the US to take on a leading role globally and develop a comprehensive strategy for increasing and strengthening women's involvement in conflict prevention and peace negotiations. But there is a lot of connecting the dots and mapping the terrain that remains to be done. The journey has only begun. This is not about men versus women. Feminists can come from both genders. The important matter is that we recognize and respect gender equality, the right of women to be heard, and to make decisions that affect the peace and security of our homelands, to promote their participation in public life, and to expand their leadership opportunities. The time just came for us to be, as women, smarter and braver about what the protection of our interests should be about, and how there is no need to mansplain a feminist foreign policy. We can speak with the greatest authority on what it means. Thank you.